My first day at Cold Pine Fire Lookout, the man I was replacing handed me a clipboard, a radio, a brass key, and a logbook that had been continuously maintained, by his count, since 1958. He told me the clipboard was for the daily weather observations, the radio was for contacting the regional dispatcher in Sonora, the brass key was for the propane shutoff, and the logbook was for everything else. He said most of the logbook would be irrelevant to me. He said I should still read all of it before my first overnight shift, especially the entries marked with a small triangle in the margin. He said the triangles were the ones to pay attention to. He said this with the same casual tone he had used to describe the propane shutoff, and I assumed, at the time, that the triangles were probably a system the previous lookouts had used to flag fire-prone weather conditions, or some similar practical concern. The man's name was Edgar Ruiz. He was 64. He was retiring after 29 fire seasons at Cold Pine. He told me he had a small house in Sonora that he and his wife had been working toward for most of those 29 years, and that his wife had recently been diagnosed with the kind of cancer that did not give a person much time, and that he was going home to be with her. He said it the way you say things when you have already made peace with them. He had a small duffel bag and a thermos and a battered paperback in his hand when he said it. The duffel was everything he was taking with him. The rest of his belongings, he said, would be picked up by his nephew the following week. So he was leaving immediately because he wanted to start the drive before dark, and because the radio truck that had brought me up the mountain was the same truck that would take him down. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm asking because the timing of these notes I'm making matters more than I expected when I started writing them, and I want to know how many people are awake at the hours when I'm awake. I am 34 years old. I had been a wildland firefighter on hand crews for 9 seasons before I took the fire watch position. I had hurt my back in the spring on a controlled burn in Oregon, badly enough that the medical board had restricted me from active fire duty for at least a season, and probably permanently. The fire watch position at Cold Pine was a way to stay on the payroll while I figured out what to do next. The pay was less than I had been making on the crew. The work was less physical, which was the point. The job was 4 months of the dry season alone in a 30-foot tower at 7,500 feet of elevation, scanning for smoke, calling in any smoke I saw, recording weather observations every 3 hours, and otherwise maintaining the lookout in a condition that the next person could move into without complications. The Forest Service had been operating Cold Pine as a manned lookout since 1932, and they had made a decision in the early 2000s to keep certain remote lookouts manned, even though most regional fire detection had moved to satellites and aerial patrols, on the theory that human observation in difficult terrain was still useful. Cold Pine was one of about a dozen lookouts in the Sierra Nevada that the Forest Service still staffed. Edgar had been the only person to hold the Cold Pine position for the past 3 decades. There had not been a competitive hiring process for my replacement of him. The position had been offered to me through a regional supervisor who had been my crew boss 2 seasons earlier and who had heard about my injury and had thought of Cold Pine as a good fit. The lookout itself was a wooden tower with a small cab at the top, accessed by an exterior staircase that wrapped around the supporting structure. The cab was about 14 feet by 14 feet, with windows on all 4 sides, a small wood stove in one corner, is a propane cooktop and a small refrigerator that ran on propane, a single bed, a chair, a desk with the radio and the weather instruments, and a small bathroom that drained into a holding tank that had to be pumped out twice a season by a contractor from the regional office. The water came from a tank on the ground that I would need to refill from a well at the bottom of the access road, which was about a half-mile of switchback that required either a long walk with a yoke or a small hand truck that Edgar had cobbled together from an old garden cart. The electricity came from solar panels and a battery bank that, Edgar told me, would run the radio and the lights and the refrigerator without issue, but would not run any heating equipment, which was why the wood stove was the only source of warmth at night. Yet the nearest paved road was 40 minutes away by truck. The nearest town was an hour and a half. There was no cell service. The radio was the only communication available, and the radio was line of sight to a relay tower on a peak about 12 miles away, which meant the radio worked from inside the cab and on the catwalk around the cab, but did not work from anywhere on the ground around the lookout, where the relay tower was blocked by intervening ridges. Edgar walked me through everything in about 45 minutes. He showed me how to read the fire weather instruments, how to operate the propane systems, how to use the Osborne fire finder in the center of the cab, how to identify the surrounding peaks by name and bearing, how to call in a smoke report, how to maintain the wood stove, how to refill the water tank. He was efficient, and he had clearly done this kind of orientation before, although I did not know with whom, since he had been the only lookout for 30 years. I asked him about it. He said he had trained relief lookouts who covered for him during his weeks off in the past, but that the Forest Service had stopped sending relief lookouts about 10 years ago, and he had been working straight through the seasons since then, with only a few short breaks at the beginning and end of each season. He said the lack of relief was one of the reasons he had decided to retire. He said the seasons had gotten harder to do alone. After he had walked me through the practical operations, he sat me down at the desk and he opened the logbook. The logbook was a hardbound ledger with green canvas covers and lined pages, the kind of book you would find in an old accounting office. The cover had been replaced at some point, probably more than once, but the pages inside were original to 1958, with new pages added as needed, the way an old ship's log accumulates. The handwriting changed throughout the book, reflecting the different lookouts who had maintained it over the decades. Edgar told me the names of the previous lookouts, in order, as he flipped through the pages. He pointed out where each one had taken over and where each one had left off. He told me a small fact about each one. The first lookout who had started the logbook was a woman named Margaret Hollis, who had been at Cold Pine for 11 years. The second was a man named Frank Padillo, who had been there for 17 years. The third was a man named Walter Clemens, who had been there for 19 years. The fourth was Edgar himself, and there had been gaps between some of them, of weeks or months, when the lookout had been unmanned during transitions. The logbook noted the gaps with brief entries by the regional office indicating that the position was vacant. Edgar then turned to a section near the back of the book. He showed me a series of entries that had small triangles drawn in the margin next to them. The triangles were in different inks and different pens, suggesting that they had been added at different times by different people. The earliest triangle was on an entry dated September of 1961. The most recent was on an entry from August of the previous year, which would have been Edgar's writing. He said, "These are the entries you need to read. Read them in order. Read all of them before your first overnight. There are 43 of them in total. As they will take you about 2 hours to read carefully, you should set aside the time. The triangles are the things that have happened at this lookout that the regional office does not know about and does not need to know about. The triangles are the institutional memory of the position. I am passing them to you the way Walter passed them to me when he retired, the way Frank passed them to Walter, the way Margaret passed them to Frank. I am asking you to read them and to take them seriously. I am also telling you that some of them will sound implausible. I am asking you to read them anyway and to follow the procedures they describe. The procedures have kept every lookout at this station alive and functional for 66 years. They will keep you alive and functional too if you follow them. He paused. He said, "Sir, I am not going to walk you through the entries individually. I do not have time. The truck is leaving in about 10 minutes and I want to be in the truck." The entries explain themselves. If you have questions after reading them, write them down, and I will answer them when you call me on the radio. I am leaving you my home phone number on a piece of paper taped to the inside of the desk drawer. The radio reaches Sonora Dispatch, and Sonora can patch you to my home line if you need to talk to me. Please do not call unless you have actually read the entries and have a specific question. I am going to be busy with my wife. I do not want to spend my time at home on the phone explaining things that the logbook explains. I told him I understood. He stood up. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the latch. He turned back. Yet he said, "One more thing. The most recent triangle is in my own handwriting, from August of last year. It describes an incident that occurred during my final summer at the lookout. The incident is the reason I am leaving the logbook with the marked entries instead of cleaning the book for the next person, which would have been the easier thing to do. I want you to read that entry last, after you have read all of the others. The most recent one will make more sense in the context of the older ones. I am sorry I cannot tell you more. Please read carefully." He left. He walked down the staircase to the truck. The truck driver loaded his duffel. The truck drove away. I watched it from the catwalk until it disappeared around the first switchback. The dust hung in the air for a long time after the truck was gone. I was alone at the lookout for the first time. I did not read the logbook that night. I want to be honest about that. I had been awake since 4 a.m. to make the drive from Sacramento, and I had been on my feet for most of the day, and Edgar's orientation had taken most of my remaining attention. I made dinner on the propane cooktop, a basic pasta with sauce from a jar. I ate at the desk while watching the sunset over the western ridges. I made my evening weather observations and called them in to Sonora Dispatch, who told me they had received them. I checked the wood stove for the night, although the temperature was warm enough that I did not need to start a fire. I went to bed at around 9 p.m. I slept hard. I woke at 5:47 a.m., which was a few minutes before sunrise. I made coffee. I sat on the catwalk with the coffee and watched the sun come up over the eastern peaks. The view from the lookout was, I will admit, one of the reasons I had taken the job. The Sierra in early morning light has a quality that I have not seen anywhere else in my work. I sat on the catwalk for almost an hour, watching the light change. I made my morning weather observations and called them in. I had breakfast. I started my first scan of the day for any smoke or unusual visibility issues across the visible terrain. The morning passed without incident. I scanned. I logged my observations. I did some basic housekeeping in the cab. I read a paperback I had brought with me. I had lunch. I made my afternoon weather observations. I started reading the logbook at around 3 p.m. I want to describe what I read because the entries are the part of the story that matter, and the order in which I read them is part of the story too. The first triangled entry from September 1961 was written by Margaret Hollis, the original lookout. The entry was short, It said, "Spotted what I took for smoke at bearing 247, distance approximately 4 miles at 3:14 a.m. Got dressed and went out on the catwalk to look more carefully. Smoke was gone by the time I reached the catwalk. Could not relocate the source. Saw it again at 3:16 a.m. Same bearing, same approximate distance. Watched it for 40 seconds. It dissipated. Did not call it in to dispatch. We'll note here, for future reference, the entry was followed by a brief addendum written in different ink, possibly by Margaret at a later date, that said, "Same observation, same bearing, same approximate time," while occurred again on the night of September 14th and again on October 2nd. The observations cluster around the new moon. Will continue to track. The triangle was in the margin next to the original entry. The second triangled entry was from October 1962. It was again written by Margaret. The entry described a similar observation, but with additional detail. She wrote, "Smoke at bearing 2, 3:14 a.m. Visible from the cab without going out on the catwalk this time. Watched it for 2 minutes. Did not dissipate as quickly as previous observations. Was able to determine that the smoke was approximately the same location each time, which I have triangulated using the Osborne to a small clearing on the south slope of the unnamed ridge below Cold Pine Peak. There is no road or trail to that location that I am aware of. Yet the clearing is in dense forest with no obvious source of fire. The smoke does not have the characteristics of a wildfire. It is white, narrow, and does not spread. It looks more like smoke from a small contained fire, like a campfire or a chimney. There is no structure at that location that I am aware of. The third entry, from May 1963, was the first one that contained a procedure. Margaret had written, "I have been observing the smoke at bearing 247 for 21 months now. I have logged 23 observations. The observations occur on nights of the new moon between 3 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., with a strong cluster at 3:14 a.m. The smoke is always at the same location. The smoke does not behave like normal wildfire smoke. The smoke does not spread, does not produce flames I can see. Jiao does not create the kind of ash signature that would be visible at this distance. I have decided that I am going to stop calling in these observations to dispatch, which I have not been doing in any case, but I am also going to stop trying to investigate the source. I have no way to reach the location safely at night, and the location is not within the boundary of land I am responsible for monitoring. I am going to log the observations when I see them, and I am going to leave them in this book for future lookouts to consider. My professional opinion is that the smoke is some kind of natural geological phenomenon, possibly a small geothermal vent that becomes visible under certain atmospheric conditions. I am not going to escalate. The fourth entry, also from Margaret, was from August 1964. It was much shorter. It said, "Tonight at 3:14 a.m. I observed not only the smoke at bearing 247, but also a small light, similar to a campfire, visible at the same location. The light lasted for approximately 90 seconds. It was not visible before or after that window. I am noting it. I am not going to call it in. The location is not on Forest Service land that I am responsible for monitoring. The location is on what I believe is private timberland owned by one of the lumber companies. If they have someone camping there, that is their concern." The fifth entry was from February 1965. It said, "I have been thinking about the light I saw in August. I have been thinking about it more than I should. I want to record here for the next lookout that I have decided not to investigate further. The light, in retrospect, did not look like a campfire, as it looked like something else that I cannot identify. I have decided that some things at this job are not for me to understand. I am going to continue to do my work, and I am going to continue to log the observations, and I am going to continue to not call them in to dispatch. I would advise the next lookout to do the same. The location at bearing 247 is not part of our responsibility. Whatever is happening there is not our concern. Logging the observations in this book is sufficient. I sat at the desk and I read those first 5 entries twice. I tried to think about what I was reading. The entries were not, on their face, alarming. They were the kind of entries you would expect from a careful observer who had encountered something she could not explain and who had chosen to document it without escalating it. And the entries were practical and grounded. Margaret was clearly a person who had thought about what she was doing and who had made a deliberate decision to manage her own response to an ambiguous situation. The triangles in the margins, however, suggested that subsequent lookouts had considered the entries important enough to flag for attention. The triangles also suggested that the entries had continued in some form after Margaret had left. I flipped forward to the next triangled entry. The entry was from April 1969, written by Frank Padillo, the second lookout. Frank had taken over from Margaret in November 1968. Frank's first triangled entry said, "Tonight at 3:14 a.m., I observed the smoke at bearing 247 that Margaret described in her notes. I had read her notes before my first overnight shift. It's as she instructed in the letter she left for me. I was prepared for the observation. The smoke appeared as she described, lasted for approximately 2 minutes, and dissipated. I have logged it here. I will continue to track." I would note that the date tonight is the second night after the new moon, not the new moon itself, which suggests Margaret's timing analysis may not have been complete. I will refine the timing as I gather more observations. The next triangled entry was from June 1969. Frank had written, "The smoke at bearing 247 has appeared on each new moon and on the 2 nights immediately following the new moon, every cycle since I began tracking in February. The pattern is more extensive than Margaret recorded. The smoke appears for 2 to 4 minutes, always between 3 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., always at the same location. I have, on 3 occasions now, observed the small light Margaret described. The light follows the smoke by approximately 5 to 10 minutes. I have not seen the light without first seeing the smoke. The light lasts for between 60 and 120 seconds." The next entry, from August 1969, said, "I want to add to the record here that I have, on the past 2 occasions when I observed the light, also heard a sound. The sound is faint, distant, the kind of sound that you would hear if a single person was singing or chanting in a clearing several miles away on a still night. The sound is not continuous. It comes and goes during the duration of the light. I am noting it for future reference. I am not going to investigate." Margaret's instruction not to investigate was, I believe, the correct instruction, and I am going to continue to follow it. The triangled entries from Frank's tenure continued for the next several pages, with a few additions per year, refining the timing, adding details about the sound, refining the location of the smoke and light. Frank was, like Margaret, a careful observer. He was also, like Margaret, clearly working hard to maintain a professional and skeptical tone. The entries did not speculate about the cause. The entries described what Frank had seen and heard, and they recorded his decision not to investigate further. I want to skip forward because the next part of what I read is the part that started to change my understanding of the situation, and I want to give it to you in the order it occurred in my own reading. The next significant triangled entry was from Walter Clemens, the third lookout, as dated September of 1985, 3 years into his tenure. Walter had inherited the logbook and the established pattern from Frank. Walter's earlier triangled entries had been similar to Frank's, careful observations of the smoke, the light, and the sound, refining the timing and the location. The September 1985 entry was different. Walter had written, "Tonight at 3:14 a.m., the smoke at bearing 247 appeared on schedule. The light appeared at 3:23 a.m., also on schedule. The sound was faint but audible, also on schedule. At 3:31 a.m., after the light had disappeared and the sound had stopped, I observed something I have not observed before. A figure walked out of the forest at the location of the smoke and stood in the clearing for approximately 4 minutes. The figure was visible to me through the binoculars, although the distance was significant and the moonlight was insufficient to make out details. The figure appeared to be a person of average height, wearing what I would describe as light-colored clothing. The figure stood in the clearing facing in the direction of the lookout. The figure did not move. After 4 minutes, the figure walked back into the forest in the direction it had come from, and I lost sight of it." Walter had added in a later note, "I have been thinking about whether to call this observation into dispatch. I have decided not to. The reasoning is the same as the reasoning for the previous observations. The location is not within my monitoring responsibility, and calling it in would require me to explain a sequence of observations that I have not been calling in for the past several years, which would create complications. I am going to continue to log and not to escalate. I would advise the next lookout to consider whether they want to handle the situation differently. I would also advise the next lookout that, in my judgment, the appearance of the figure was a significant change in the pattern, and that the pattern should now be considered to have escalated to a level that may, eventually, require a different response. I do not know what that response should be. I am leaving the question open for whoever takes over after me." The next triangled entry was from Walter, dated June of 1986. He had written, "The figure has now appeared on 3 additional occasions since September of 1985. The appearances follow the same protocol. Smoke at 3:14 a.m., light at 3:23 a.m., sound during the light. And then the figure walks out of the forest at approximately 3:31 a.m. and stands in the clearing for between 3 and 5 minutes. The figure has been visible from the lookout on all 3 occasions. The figure has stood facing the lookout each time. The figure has not moved during the standing period. The figure has, on the most recent occasion, raised one arm and held it raised for approximately 30 seconds before lowering it. I do not know what the gesture was meant to convey. I am noting it. I sat at the desk in the cab at Cold Pine, and I read those entries, and I felt something shift in my understanding of where I was. The entries were not the records of a phenomenon that had been gradually understood and managed. The entries were the records of a phenomenon that had been gradually escalating over decades, and that the lookouts had been carefully not addressing, because addressing it would have required them to confront what was actually happening at bearing 247, which was, by the evidence in the logbook, something that involved a person, or something that looked like a person, that had been appearing in a clearing 4 miles from the lookout on a regular schedule for almost 40 years, gesturing in the direction of the lookout. I had 30 more triangled entries to read. The logbook was open on the desk in front of me. The light was beginning to shift toward late afternoon. I had hours before my next scheduled weather observation. I had nothing to do but keep reading. I kept reading. The next entry, from Walter in October 1987, said, "The figure has begun to walk closer." On the night of October 14th, after the standard sequence of smoke, light, and sound, the figure walked out of the forest and into the clearing as before. After standing for approximately 4 minutes, the figure walked east, in the direction of the lookout, for approximately 100 yards before stopping. The figure stood at the new position for an additional 2 minutes before turning and walking back into the forest. I have measured the distance using the Osborne. The figure is now approximately 3.5 miles from the lookout instead of 4. I am noting the change. The next entry, from Walter in March 1989, said, "The figure has been gradually closing the distance." The current distance, as of last night's observation, is approximately 3 miles. The pattern is consistent. The figure walks out of the forest, stands in the original clearing, then walks east toward the lookout for some additional distance, stands again, then returns to the forest. The additional distance has been increasing. The figure does not, as far as I can observe, do anything during the standing periods. The figure simply stands and faces the lookout. I want to note that I have considered, on multiple occasions, taking my truck down the access road and driving to a location where I could intercept the figure. I have not done this. The reasoning, again, is that the location of the figure is not within my monitoring responsibility, and an intercept would require me to leave the lookout, which would be a violation of my standing orders to remain at the post during overnight hours. I am also, I will admit here for the record, reluctant to attempt an intercept for personal reasons that I do not need to enumerate. The next triangled entry, from Walter in November 1991, was longer than the previous ones. He had written, "I have been at this lookout for 9 years. I have been observing the bearing 247 sequence for all 9 of those years. The figure has been appearing for 6 of them. The figure is now approximately 2.5 miles from the lookout, which is a distance that I can see clearly with binoculars under good moonlight. I have, in my recent observations, been able to make out additional details about the figure. The figure is, by my best estimate, a man of average height. The figure wears what I would describe as a long-sleeved white shirt and dark pants. The figure has dark hair. The figure's face is, even at 2.5 miles, not clearly distinguishable, but the general impression I have of the face is that of a man in his middle years, possibly in his 40s or 50s. The figure does not appear to be elderly and does not appear to be young." He had continued, "I want to note something else here that I have been hesitant to put in writing. I have been comparing the figure's appearance to old photographs that I found in the back of the storage cabinet in the cab. The photographs are black and white, taken at various points in the lookout's history, dating back to the 1930s. The photographs were apparently taken by previous lookouts and were left in the cabinet, possibly accidentally, possibly deliberately. There are 17 photographs in total. I have looked at all of them carefully. One of the photographs, dated by a notation on the back to 1936, shows 3 men standing in front of an early version of the lookout structure. The middle man in the photograph, by my best comparison, matches the appearance of the figure I have been observing. The match is not certain. The photograph is small and the resolution is poor. But the general resemblance is, in my judgment, strong enough to be worth noting. I do not know who the man in the photograph was. The photograph has no identification on the back beyond the date. I am noting this here for future reference. I would advise the next lookout to look at the photographs in the cabinet and to make their own comparison. I stopped reading. I went to the storage cabinet in the cab. The storage cabinet was a tall, narrow cabinet against the wall opposite the desk. Yet I had not opened it during Edgar's orientation, although he had pointed it out to me as the place where the previous lookouts had kept various items that were not part of the official inventory of the lookout. I opened the cabinet now. The cabinet contained a collection of items accumulated over decades. There was an old brass barometer, a set of wool blankets, several boxes of matches, a metal flashlight, a small fishing tackle box, a stack of paperback books, a pair of binoculars older than the ones I had been issued, and at the bottom, in a manila envelope, a stack of photographs. I took the envelope back to the desk. I opened it. I went through the photographs one by one. There were 17 of them, as Walter had described. The photographs were black and white, of various ages. It's showing different people at different times in the history of the lookout. Most of the photographs were of lookouts at the cab door, or in the cab, or on the catwalk. A few were of work crews who had been at the lookout for maintenance or construction. A few were of visitors, possibly Forest Service supervisors or other officials. The dates were noted in pencil on the backs of most of the photographs. The 1936 photograph was the third one in the stack. It showed 3 men standing in front of the lookout structure, which was at that time a smaller building than the current cab, and which had been replaced, by my knowledge of the structure's history, in the 1947 reconstruction. The 3 men were dressed in what looked like civilian Conservation Corps uniforms, which would have been consistent with the era. The man in the middle was, by Walter's description, the one I needed to look at. I looked at him. I held the photograph close to the desk lamp, and I looked at his face for a long time. The man in the middle was in his 40s or 50s, of average height, with dark hair, wearing a long-sleeved shirt that looked light in color and dark pants. His face was, by the resolution of the photograph, somewhat indistinct, but I could make out the general features. He had a thin face, a long nose, dark eyes, and a serious expression. He was not smiling. The 2 men flanking him were younger and were both smiling at the camera. The man in the middle was not. I had no way to compare the man in the photograph to the figure that Walter had been observing, because the figure was at the bearing 247 location, and the figure had not appeared, as far as I knew, during my time at the lookout. I had no current observation to compare to. I had only Walter's description and Walter's claim that the man in the 1936 photograph was, in his judgment, the same person as the figure he was observing in 1991, 55 years after the photograph had been taken. I went back to the logbook. I kept reading. The next triangled entry, from Walter in June 1992, said, "I have shown the 1936 photograph to no one. I have considered, on several occasions, taking the photograph to the regional office and asking whether anyone there has any records about the men in it. I have decided not to. The reasoning is, again, that calling attention to this matter would create complications I am not prepared to manage. I am going to leave the photograph in the cabinet. I am going to leave the logbook with my observations. And I am going to retire, eventually, and I am going to pass the situation to my replacement." The next triangled entry, also from Walter, was dated August of 1995. The entry was different in tone from the previous ones. Walter had written, "I am writing this entry several days after the events I am describing, because I needed time to compose myself before putting the events on the record. On the night of August 17th, the standard sequence at bearing 247 occurred at the standard times. The figure appeared at the standard time after the light. The figure walked the standard distance toward the lookout. The figure stood at its current closest point, which is approximately 2 miles from the lookout, and faced the lookout for the standard duration. At the end of the standing period, instead of returning to the forest in the direction it had come from, the figure turned and walked east, toward the lookout, for an additional approximately quarter mile before stopping in a small open area where I could see it more clearly than I had ever seen it before. He continued, "Through the binoculars, at the new position, I could see the figure's face with significantly more detail than I had ever seen before. The face was, by my judgment, the same face as the man in the 1936 photograph. The match was, in my view, no longer ambiguous. The face was the same face. The man was somehow 60 years older than the photograph would suggest, and yet his face had not aged. I want to be precise about what I am claiming. I am not claiming that the figure was the same man as the man in the 1936 photograph, and I am claiming that the face was the same face. The two claims are different. I do not know what to make of the difference. I am noting it for the record." He continued, "After standing in the new position for approximately 5 minutes, the figure raised both arms and held them raised, palms facing the lookout, for approximately 90 seconds. The figure then lowered the arms and turned and walked back into the forest by the original route. The standard sequence completed at the standard time. I logged the observation. I went back to bed. I did not sleep. I have not slept well since." The next entry, from Walter in November 1995, said, "I am giving notice to the regional office of my retirement, effective at the end of the current fire season. And the official reason I am giving is that I am tired and that I want to spend more time with my family. The actual reason is that I cannot continue to manage the bearing 247 situation alone, and I do not see any way to address it without creating professional complications that I am not prepared to face. I am going to recommend a replacement to the regional office. I have a candidate in mind. His name is Edgar Ruiz. He worked as a relief lookout for me 3 summers ago, and I trained him on the bearing 247 procedures during his relief stints. He understood. He did not need extensive explanation. I will recommend him for the position. He will, I expect, be hired without significant scrutiny, the way I was hired and the way Frank was hired before me. The position is not competitive. The regional office trusts the recommendations of the outgoing lookout. Edgar will inherit this logbook and these observations. He will continue the practice. I am sorry, Edgar, that I am leaving this for you. I would not be retiring if I did not think you could handle it. I would be staying. I cannot stay." I had now reached Edgar's entries. I had read the logbook for almost 3 hours. The light outside the cab had shifted to late afternoon, and the temperature inside the cab was warm enough that I had opened the catwalk door to let in some air. I made myself a cup of coffee at the propane stove. I went out on the catwalk with the coffee, and I stood and looked out at the surrounding terrain. Bearing 247 was visible from the catwalk. I had walked around the catwalk during my morning routine, and I had identified it by reference to the Osborne firefinder inside the cab, the various bearings, and the major landmarks on each one. Bearing 247 was a bearing that pointed toward a wooded ridge to the southwest, with a series of clearings visible at various distances. The clearing at 4 miles, which was the original location of the smoke that Margaret had observed in 1961, was visible if you knew where to look. The clearing was a small open area in dense conifer forest on what looked like the south slope of an unnamed ridge below a peak that the Osborne identified as Cold Pine Peak. The peak gave the lookout its name. The clearing was, by my measurement, in deeply remote terrain that would have been difficult to access on foot and impossible to reach by vehicle. I stood on the catwalk and I looked at the clearing. I tried to imagine a man walking out of the forest and standing in the clearing and facing the lookout. I tried to imagine what he would have looked like at 4 miles, at 3 miles, at 2.25 miles. I tried to imagine what Walter had seen on the night of August 17th, 1995, when the figure had been close enough that Walter had been able to recognize his face. I went back inside the cab. I made myself a sandwich for dinner. I ate it at the desk while I read Edgar's entries. Edgar's first triangled entry was dated July 1996, his first summer as the Cold Pine Lookout. He had written, "Walter prepared me well. The bearing 247 sequence occurred last night for the first time during my tenure, and I was prepared for it. The smoke appeared at 3:14 a.m., the light at 3:23 a.m., the sound during the light, and the figure walked out of the forest at 3:31 a.m. The figure stood at its closest position, which Walter had described in his final entries, and faced the lookout for approximately 5 minutes. I observed the figure with the binoculars. I confirmed the resemblance to the man in the 1936 photograph that Walter had described. The resemblance is, as Walter said, no longer ambiguous. The face is the same face. I do not know what this means. I am noting the observation for the record. Edgar's entries continued in the same careful tone as Walter's for the next 28 years. The pattern continued. The figure appeared on each new moon and on the 2 nights after, between 3 a.m. and 3:30 a.m., at the same closest position. The figure stood for the same duration. The figure raised its arms occasionally. The figure returned to the forest. For the first 10 years of Edgar's tenure, the figure did not move closer than the position Walter had described. The pattern was stable. Edgar's entries reflected this. He wrote shorter entries as the years went on, simply noting that the standard sequence had occurred at the standard times. In 2007, the pattern changed. Edgar's triangled entry from June of that year said, "The figure has begun to walk closer again." On the night of June 16th, after the standard sequence, the figure walked east beyond its previous closest position for approximately an additional half-mile before stopping. The figure stood at the new position for approximately 7 minutes, longer than the previous standard. The figure raised its arms during the standing period, showed the new position is approximately 1.75 miles from the lookout. The entries from 2007 to the present documented a slow, continued progression. The figure had moved closer in irregular increments, sometimes pausing for years at a particular distance before moving closer again. By 2015, the figure was at 1 mile. By 2020, the figure was at 3/4 mile. Edgar's entry from 2020 noted that he could now see the figure's face clearly without binoculars. He confirmed that the face had not aged across the 24 years he had been observing it. In 2023, Edgar had written, "The figure has begun to do something new. After the standard standing period at its current closest position, which is now approximately half a mile from the lookout, the figure has, on 3 occasions since June, it had walked the additional distance to the base of the lookout staircase. The figure stops at the base of the staircase. The figure stands there for between 2 and 5 minutes. The figure does not attempt to climb the stairs. The figure has not, on any of the 3 occasions, looked up at the cab or made any visible indication that it knows the lookout is occupied. After the standing period at the staircase, the figure turns and walks back into the forest by the standard route. I have been in the cab during all 3 of these occurrences. I have not gone out on the catwalk. I have not made any sound or shown any light. The figure has not, as far as I can determine, registered my presence. I sat at the desk. I had read 42 of the 43 triangled entries. I had 1 entry left. I had been reading for almost 5 hours. Yes, the light outside then had shifted to early evening, and the sun was beginning to set. I needed to make my evening weather observations and call them in to dispatch. I made the observations. I called them in. The dispatcher in Sonora was a woman named Patty, whose voice I had spoken to that morning. She acknowledged the observations. She wished me a good night. She told me to call in if I needed anything. I told her I would. I made dinner. I ate it at the desk. I did not read the last entry yet. I wanted to wait until after I had eaten and after the cab was settled for the night. I did not know why I wanted to wait. I just did. After dinner, I cleaned up. I went out on the catwalk with my flashlight. I checked the perimeter of the cab. The temperature had dropped significantly with the sunset. I went back inside. I closed the catwalk door. I locked it, which was something I had not done the previous night, but which I now wanted to do. I went to the desk. I sat down. I opened the logbook to the last triangled entry. The last entry was dated August 19th of the previous year. It was in Edgar's handwriting. It was the longest entry in the logbook. It took up almost 3 full pages. Edgar had written, "I am writing this entry on the morning after the event I am describing. I have not slept. I do not know if I will be able to sleep tonight. I have decided that I am going to retire at the end of this season, which is in approximately 9 weeks. I have decided that I am not going to recommend a replacement to the regional office. I have decided that the regional office can find someone on their own. I do not want to be responsible for putting another person into the position that I have been in for the past 28 years and that I am no longer able to maintain." He continued, "Last night was the new moon. The standard sequence at bearing 247 began at the standard time. The smoke appeared at 3:14 a.m., the light at 3:23 a.m., the sound during the light. The figure walked out of the forest at 3:31 a.m. The figure walked the standard distance to its current closest position, which has been at the base of the lookout staircase for the past 14 months. The figure arrived at the base of the staircase at approximately 3:47 a.m. The figure stood at the base of the staircase, as it has done on every occasion since June 2023. He continued, "At approximately 3:52 a.m., the figure climbed the first step of the staircase, and the figure had never done this before. The figure climbed slowly, 1 step at a time, with what I would describe as deliberate pacing. The staircase has 32 steps from the base to the catwalk. The figure climbed all 32 steps. The climb took approximately 4 minutes. I was in the cab. I was at the desk. The cab door, which is the door from the catwalk into the cab, was closed but not locked. The lock on the cab door is the kind of lock that engages only when you turn the deadbolt. I had not turned the deadbolt that night. I had not turned the deadbolt on any night during my 28 years at the lookout. There had never been any reason to." He continued, "The figure reached the catwalk at approximately 3:56 a.m. I could hear the footsteps on the wooden boards of the catwalk. The figure walked around the catwalk slowly, yet I could track its progress by the sound of the footsteps. The figure walked the full perimeter of the cab. The figure stopped multiple times in front of each of the 4 windows of the cab. I do not know whether the figure looked into the cab through the windows. The interior of the cab was dark. I had turned off all of the lights when the standard sequence had begun, which had been my practice for many years, on the theory that the darkness would make the lookout less visible to whoever or whatever was at the other end of the bearing 247 sequence. I do not know whether the practice was effective. I do not know whether the figure could see me through the windows in the dark. I sat at the desk. I did not move. I held my breath when the figure stopped at each window. The figure stopped at each window for approximately 30 seconds. Yes, after completing the perimeter, the figure walked back to the cab door. He continued, "The cab door has a brass handle on the catwalk side. The handle is the kind of handle that you turn down to open the door. I watched the handle. The handle turned down. The door did not open. I do not know why the door did not open. The door was not locked. The door should have opened. The door did not open. The handle turned back up. There was a pause of approximately 10 seconds. The handle turned down again. The door did not open. The handle turned back up. There was another pause. The pattern repeated, by my count, 14 times. The door did not open on any of the attempts. After the 14th attempt, the figure walked back to the staircase, descended the 32 steps, walked back across the clearing at the base of the lookout, and disappeared into the forest by the standard route. The standard sequence completed at approximately 4:42 a.m., which is more than an hour after the standard ending time. He continued, "I sat at the desk for the rest of the night. I did not move. I did not turn on any lights. I waited for sunrise. When the sun came up, I went to the cab door. I examined the handle. I examined the latch mechanism. The handle and the latch are in good working order. The door, when I tested it after sunrise, opened normally. I do not know why the door did not open during the figure's attempts. I have no explanation for the fact that the door did not open. I have, in the hours since the event, considered every possible explanation. I cannot identify any mechanical reason for the door's behavior," he continued. I am writing this entry to inform the next lookout, if there is a next lookout, that the cab door at this lookout has, by some mechanism I do not understand, the property of not opening to whoever or whatever was attempting to open it last night. I am not going to claim that the door has this property in general. I am only going to claim that on the night of August 18th, 2024, the door did not open to the figure. The door opened normally to me the next morning. I do not know whether the door will continue to refuse to open to the figure on future occasions. I do not know whether the door's behavior was a function of the door itself, or of the figure, or of some interaction between them, or of some other factor that I have not identified. He continued, I am also going to record here that I have, over the years, observed certain conditions that I have never written down before because I considered them too speculative to put in the logbook. I am going to write them down now because I am leaving, and because the next lookout, if there is one, deserves the full record. The conditions are these. The figure has only attempted to climb the staircase on nights when the cab door was unlocked. I have, on a small number of nights over the years, locked the cab door before bed for various reasons unrelated to the bearing 247 sequence. On those nights, the figure has not approached the staircase. The figure has stopped at the base of the staircase, stood for the usual duration, and then returned to the forest. The figure has, by my observation, some way of knowing whether the door is locked. I do not know how the figure knows. I am noting it for the record. He continued. The other condition I want to record is this. The figure has, since 2023, when it began to approach the base of the staircase, only done so on nights when I have been in the cab alone. On nights when I have had visitors, which has been rare but has occurred occasionally over the years, the figure has stopped at its previous closest position and has not approached the staircase. I do not know how the figure knows whether I am alone. I am noting it for the record. He continued. I am leaving the logbook with the marked entries. I am leaving the photographs in the cabinet. I am leaving the cab door lock in working order. I am, by writing this entry, giving the next lookout the most honest record I can give of what has happened at this position over the past 66 years. Yet I would advise the next lookout to lock the cab door every night without exception. I would advise the next lookout to never go out on the catwalk during the standard sequence at bearing 247. I would advise the next lookout to never make any attempt to acknowledge the figure or to communicate with it in any way. I would advise the next lookout to consider whether they want to continue the practice of not reporting the bearing 247 sequence to the regional office, which has been the practice of every lookout at this position since Margaret began the logbook in 1958, or whether they want to break that practice and report the situation. I would not advise either course. I would say that both courses have costs, and the next lookout will have to decide which costs they are willing to bear. He continued, I am sorry, whoever you are, that you are reading this. I would not have left this for you if I had been able to manage the situation alone. I have failed to manage it. The figure has, by my observation, been moving closer for 40 years. The figure has now reached the cab door. The figure has been turned away once by a mechanism I do not understand. I do not know whether the figure will be turned away again. I am leaving before I find out. I would understand if you decided to leave too. I would understand if you decided to lock the cab door tonight and to drive back down the access road and to never come back. I am not going to recommend that you do this because I do not want to be responsible for the lookout being unmanned and the regional office having to figure out what to do, but I would understand. The entry ended there. There was no signature. Yet there was just the final period at the end of the final sentence. I closed the logbook. I sat at the desk for a long time. The cab was almost completely dark. The sun had set while I had been reading. I had not turned on the lights. The only light in the cab was the dim red glow from the radio's standby indicator and the faint moonlight coming through the windows. I stood up. I walked to the cab door. I checked the deadbolt. The deadbolt was not engaged. I turned it. The deadbolt slid into the strike plate with a small click. I tested the handle from the inside. The handle turned, but the door did not open. The lock was working. I checked the calendar that was tacked to the wall next to the desk. The calendar had been Edgar's. The calendar was a Forest Service calendar with the moon phases marked on each date. The next new moon was in 7 days. I did not sleep well that first week. I want to be honest about that. I locked the cab door every night, the way Edgar had advised. I made my weather observations on schedule. I called them in to dispatch on schedule. I scanned for smoke during the day. I read books. I cooked simple meals. I tried to maintain the routines of the job. I tried to act as though I had not just spent 5 hours reading the documented history of a 66-year-old phenomenon that had, in the past year, escalated to the point of attempting to enter the structure I was now living in. The first 3 days passed without incident. The cab door stayed locked at night. The radio worked. The weather was clear. I scanned the bearing 247 location during the day in good light with binoculars. At the clearing where the figure was supposed to walk out of the forest looked, in daylight, like an ordinary clearing in a remote stretch of conifer forest. I could see no sign of any structure, any path, any evidence that anyone had ever been there. The forest around the clearing was old growth, with trees that were probably over 200 years old, and there was no logging activity in the area. The land was, as Margaret had originally observed, private timber land owned by a lumber company. I looked up the lumber company in the regional reference materials in the cab. The company had owned the land since 1947. The company had not actively logged the section of land that contained the bearing 247 clearing during my lifetime, by my reading of the records. The land was, for practical purposes, untouched. On the fourth day, I made a decision. I decided I was going to call Edgar. I had told myself during my first 3 days that I would not call him, because he had asked not to be called unless I had specific questions, and because I had not been able to formulate a question that I felt was specific enough to justify the call. By the fourth day, I had decided that the situation was extreme enough that the question of justification was not the right question. The right question was whether I was willing to do this job alone for the 4 months of the fire season, with the next new moon 3 days away, without having spoken to the only other person on Earth who had any direct experience with what I was about to face. The answer to that question was no. I picked up the radio. I called Sonora Dispatch. The dispatcher who answered was a man this time, not Patty, yet I asked him to patch me through to a phone number that I gave him. He asked me whether the call was an emergency. I told him it was not an emergency, but that it was related to a transition issue with the previous lookout that I needed to resolve. He said he would patch me through. He warned me that the phone connection through the radio was poor quality and that the call would be one way, meaning I would have to say, "over," at the end of each statement and wait for a response. I told him I understood. He patched me through. The phone rang on the other end. A woman answered. The voice was older. She sounded tired. I said, "Hello, this is John Vargas. I'm the new fire lookout at Cold Pine. I'm trying to reach Edgar Ruiz. Over." There was a pause. The woman said, "Edgar passed away on Sunday. I'm his wife. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you. The funeral was yesterday." I sat at the desk in the cab with the radio handset in my hand. The dispatcher was still on the line, monitoring the call, the way the dispatchers do. I could hear his breathing faintly in the background. I said, "I'm so sorry for your loss. I didn't know." Over. She said, "I appreciate that. He talked about you. He told me he had handed off the lookout to a young man who had been a wildland firefighter. He said he hoped you would do well there. He said the lookout was a good place to spend a season." I asked her, in the careful way that you ask things in a one-way call, whether Edgar had ever discussed the bearing 247 situation with her. I told her I would understand if he had not, and I did not want to pry, but that I had read the logbook and had questions that I had been hoping to ask Edgar. She was quiet for a long time. The dispatcher checked in. He asked whether the call was still active. I told him it was. The woman came back on the line. She said, "Edgar told me about it. He told me about it last year, after the night when the figure came up the staircase. He told me because he had decided to retire and because he wanted me to understand why. He had not told me about it before, in all of our years together. He had carried it alone. I want to tell you what he told me, because I think you should know, and because I do not want the information to die with him." She said, Edgar told me that the figure at bearing 247 was, by his belief, the man in the 1936 photograph. Edgar told me he had spent 30 years trying to identify the man in the photograph. He had gone to the regional office archives. He had gone to the County Historical Society. He had gone to the public library in Sonora. He had looked at every Forest Service personnel record he could access for the years 1932 through 1940, which was the period during which the lookout had been originally constructed and staffed. He had identified the two younger men in the photograph after considerable research. The two younger men were CCC enrollees who had worked on the lookout's construction in 1935 and 1936. They had been assigned to a CCC camp in the Stanislaus National Forest. Both of them had died in the 1970s of natural causes in different parts of the country. Edgar had located their families and had spoken with the surviving descendants. And if the descendants had confirmed the identifications, neither family had been able to identify the third man, the man in the middle. The two CCC enrollees had been the only people in the photograph that the families had recognized. She said, Edgar had eventually found, in the archives of the Historical Society, a single mention of a man whose description matched the man in the photograph. The mention was in a brief news article from a small newspaper that had served the area in the 1930s. The article was dated April of 1936. The article reported that a man named Edward Halloran, who had been working as a foreman on the construction of the Cold Pine Fire Lookout, had been reported missing by his wife. The article said that Halloran had failed to return to his lodgings in town after his last shift at the lookout site, and that a search by the CCC and by local law enforcement had not located him. The article said that Halloran had been 47 years old, of average height, with dark hair, and had been wearing a long-sleeve white shirt and dark pants when he was last seen. The article said that he had been working at the lookout site for approximately 3 weeks before his disappearance, and that he was originally from Reno. The article noted that Halloran's wife was offering a small reward for any information about his whereabouts. She said, Edgar had searched for any follow-up to the article. He had not found one. The newspaper had ceased publication in 1941. The county records did not include a death certificate for Edward Halloran. The Reno records did not show any record of him after 1936. He had, by every indication Edgar could find, had simply vanished from the records in April of 1936, and the disappearance had not been investigated beyond the initial search. She said, Edgar believed that Edward Halloran was the man in the 1936 photograph, and that the figure at bearing 247 was, in some way that Edgar could not explain, Edward Halloran himself. Edgar had not been able to determine what had happened to Halloran in April of 1936. He had not been able to determine why the figure had begun to appear at bearing 247 in 1961, 25 years after Halloran's disappearance. He had not been able to determine why the figure had been moving slowly toward the lookout for the past 40 years, or why the figure had begun, in 2023, to climb the staircase, or why the cab door had refused to open to the figure on the night of August 18th, 2024. Edgar had, in his last year at the lookout, decided that he was not going to be able to answer any of these questions, and that the only response he could make to the situation was to retire and to leave the lookout in the hands of someone else. She said, Edgar told me that he had considered, in his final months at the lookout, going down to the bearing 247, clearing himself, in daylight, to see what was there. He had decided not to. He had told me that the reason he had decided not to was that he had been worried that whatever was at the clearing would, in some way, return with him to the lookout if he visited it. and that bringing whatever was there into closer proximity to himself was not a thing he was willing to do. He had, in his words, decided to leave the situation alone. She said, "That I am telling you all of this because Edgar wanted me to. He left a letter for me in the days before he died, in case anyone from the lookout contacted me. The letter said that I should tell whoever called whatever they wanted to know. He wrote that he did not want the next lookout to be in the situation he had been in, of having to manage the Bearing 247 sequence without any context for what was happening. He wrote that the regional office would not provide any context because the regional office did not know, and that the only context available was the context that had been passed down through the logbook and through the photographs and through the personal investigations of the previous lookouts. He wanted you to have all of it." She paused. She said, "I am also telling you this because I want to add something to what Edgar told me. I want to add it because Edgar did not include it in his letter, and I do not know whether he would have wanted me to share it. I am going to share it anyway because I think it is relevant." She said, "Edgar told me, in the days before he died, that the figure had appeared to him in his hospital room. He told me this the day before he died. He said the figure had come to the room at night when I was not there, and had stood at the foot of the bed for a few minutes before leaving. He said the figure had not done anything. The figure had simply stood and looked at him. He said the figure had appeared on 3 nights in a row, beginning 4 nights before his death. He said he had not told the nurses or the doctors because he had not wanted to be assessed for hallucinations. He said he had told me because he wanted someone to know." She said, "I want to tell you, John, because I think you should know, that the figure may not be confined to the lookout. I do not know what this means for you. I do not know whether the figure will continue to appear at the lookout now that Edgar is gone, or whether the figure has, in some way, transferred to wherever the figure follows. I do not know whether the figure will appear to you in the cab, or whether the figure will continue to appear at Bearing 247, or whether the figure will do both. I am telling you what I know, which is that the figure was at my husband's hospital bedside in his final days, and that whatever the figure is, it does not appear to be limited to the location at the lookout." I held the radio handset. The dispatcher was still on the line. I could hear him breathing. I did not say anything for a long time. I said, "Mrs. Ruiz, thank you for telling me. I am very sorry for your loss. I appreciate you taking the time to share this with me." "Over." She said, "You're welcome, John. Please take care of yourself. Edgar would have wanted you to. Please lock the door." The line clicked off. The dispatcher came back on. He said, "Cold Pine, are you all right?" I told him I was fine. I told him the call had been about a personal matter related to the previous lookout. I told him I appreciated his patching me through. He said he understood. He told me to call back if I needed anything. He signed off. I sat at the desk. I sat there for a long time. The cab was quiet. The wind was moving through the trees outside. I could hear the small sounds the wooden structure made when the temperature shifted. I tried to think about what I had been told. If the situation was, by Mrs. Ruiz's account, larger than the logbook had suggested. The logbook had recorded the figure's behavior at the Bearing 247 location and its gradual approach to the lookout. The logbook had not addressed the possibility that the figure could appear elsewhere. Edgar had encountered the figure in his hospital room in Sonora, more than 2 hours away from the lookout, and had been observed by it 3 nights in a row before his death. The figure had, by that account, followed Edgar after his retirement. The figure had not been confined to the lookout's vicinity. The figure was, by every reasonable inference I could draw, capable of appearing to people who had been associated with the lookout, regardless of their physical location. This had implications that I had not previously considered. The implications were that locking the cab door at night, while it might prevent the figure from entering the cab during the new moon sequence at bearing 247, would not necessarily prevent the figure from interacting with me in other ways or at other times. The implications were that my decision to take the lookout job had, possibly, made me a future target of the figure, regardless of where I was or what precautions I took. The implications were that the figure was, by some mechanism, attached to the position of lookout at Cold Pine, and that anyone who held the position would, eventually, be visited by the figure either at the lookout or elsewhere, and that the visits would not necessarily end when the person left the position. I want to be honest about my emotional state at this point. I was scared. I was scared in a way I had not been scared during my 9 seasons of wildland firefighting. The fires I had fought were, however dangerous, fires. They had behaviors I could predict, and they could be fought with techniques I had been trained on. And the people who had died on the fires I had worked had died in ways that I could understand. The figure at bearing 247 was not a fire. The figure was a phenomenon I did not understand and had no training to address. The figure was, by the documented record, capable of approaching the lookout, of climbing the staircase, of attempting to open the cab door. The figure was, by Mrs. Ruiz's account, capable of appearing to former lookouts in their hospital rooms in distant towns. I thought about leaving. I thought about packing up my belongings and driving down the access road and never coming back. I thought about what I would tell the regional office. I thought about the fact that I had no other job lined up, and that the income from the lookout was the only income I had, and that my back injury had not yet been cleared by the medical board for return to fire crew work. I thought about Mrs. Ruiz. I thought about Edgar carrying the situation alone for 28 years. I thought about Walter carrying it for 19 years before him. I thought about Frank for 17 years and Margaret for 11 years before that. I thought about the unbroken chain of lookouts who had documented the situation in the logbook and had passed it on, yet each one knowing that they were passing on a problem they had not been able to solve and that they could not solve, and that the next person would have to live with the same problem and would have to make the same choices about how to manage it. I thought about whether leaving the position would, by some mechanism I did not understand, mark me as a former lookout in the same way that Edgar had been a former lookout, and whether the figure would visit me wherever I went, the way the figure had visited Edgar in his hospital room. I thought about whether staying at the lookout was, in some way, safer than leaving, because at least at the lookout I had the structure and the locked door and the documented procedures, and the figure was constrained to its standard sequence at bearing 247 and its gradual approach to the staircase. Yet I did not arrive at a clear answer. I sat at the desk and I tried to think, and I did not arrive at clarity. I made a decision. I decided I was going to stay at the lookout for the rest of the season. I decided this for practical reasons that I am not going to defend as morally admirable. I needed the income. I had nowhere else to go. I had told my brother in Fresno that I would be at the lookout for 4 months, and going back to him after a week would have required explanations I did not want to give. I decided I would stay through the season, follow the procedures Edgar had documented, lock the cab door every night, and hope that the figure's attempts at the door on the next new moon would be turned away by the same mechanism that had turned them away on August 18th, 2024. And I also decided that I would not attempt to investigate the bearing 247 location during my time at the lookout. I would not go down to the clearing. I would not try to learn anything about Edward Halloran beyond what Mrs. Ruiz had told me. I would treat the situation the way Margaret had treated it, the way Frank had treated it, the way Walter had treated it, the way Edgar had treated it. I would document. I would not engage. I would pass the situation on to whoever came after me with whatever additional information I had been able to gather, the way it had been passed on to me. The next new moon was 3 days away. I spent the next 3 days preparing. I cleaned the cab. I checked the door lock multiple times. I made sure the deadbolt was working smoothly and that the strike plate was firmly attached. I checked the windows. The windows in the cab were the original windows from the 1947 reconstruction, single-pane glass in wooden frames, and they were not designed to be locked. The windows had simple latches that would prevent them from being opened from the outside, but would not prevent breaking. I considered whether to reinforce the windows. I decided not to. The figure had, in the documented history, never attempted to enter through a window. The figure had attempted to enter through the door. I would prepare for the documented behavior and not for hypothetical behavior I had not seen evidence of. I made notes in a small notebook of my own, separate from the logbook. I wrote down the things Mrs. Ruiz had told me. I wrote down the times of my observations. I wrote down my plans for the night of the new moon. I wrote down a brief letter to my brother, in case I did not survive the night, explaining where the lookout was and what to do with my belongings. I sealed the letter in an envelope and put it on the desk where it would be easily found. I considered this step morbid. I did it anyway. The night of the new moon was a Thursday. I made my evening weather observations on schedule and called them in to dispatch. The dispatcher was Patty. I had spoken with her several times over the past week, and she had become a familiar voice. I considered telling her, vaguely, that I might have something to discuss with her in the morning. I decided not to. I did not want to alert dispatch to anything before I had any actual information to alert them about. I made dinner. I ate it at the desk. I washed my dishes and put them away. And then I went out on the catwalk before sunset and looked at the bearing 247, clearing through the binoculars one more time. The clearing was, in the late afternoon light, an ordinary clearing. There was no sign of anyone or anything in it. I went back inside the cab. I closed the catwalk door. I locked the deadbolt. I turned off all the lights in the cab. I sat at the desk in the dark. I had a flashlight on the desk in case I needed light. I had my watch on the desk so I could track the time. I had a small bottle of water and a granola bar in case I got thirsty or hungry. The sun set at 8:14 p.m. The cab grew dark gradually. The moonlight that night was minimal because of the new moon, but the starlight was bright enough to illuminate the catwalk faintly through the windows. I could see the rough outlines of the 4 windows and the door, and I could see the dim shape of my own hand if I held it in front of my face. I sat at the desk. I waited. The hours between sunset and 3 a.m. passed slowly. I did not sleep. I did not move much. I tried to keep my breathing even. I listened to the small sounds of the cab and the wind and the forest below the lookout. I drank some of the water. I ate the granola bar around midnight. I checked my watch every 15 minutes or so, the way you check your watch when you are trying not to check it constantly. At 3:14 a.m., I was looking out the southwest window of the cab. The window faced bearing 247. I had positioned myself at the desk so that I could see the window without standing up. The clearing at 4 miles was not visible at night, but the general direction of the bearing was something I could orient toward. At 3:14 a.m., and I saw a small thread of smoke at bearing 247. The smoke was visible only because the starlight caught it briefly as it rose. The smoke lasted for about 2 minutes and dissipated. At 3:23 a.m., I saw a small light at the same bearing. The light was steady and small, like the light from a small fire or a lantern. The light lasted for approximately 90 seconds before it went out. I did not hear the sound that Frank had described. I do not know whether the sound was too faint to hear from the cab with the door closed, or whether the sound did not occur on this night, or whether I simply did not hear it because I was focused on watching for the figure. At 3:31 a.m., I waited for the figure to walk out of the forest. The figure did not appear. I waited for 10 more minutes. The figure did not appear. I waited for 20 more minutes. It's just the figure did not appear. At 4:02 a.m., I heard a sound. The sound was the sound of footsteps on the wooden boards of the catwalk. The footsteps had not been preceded by the sound of someone climbing the staircase. The figure had not, by the audible record, walked from the forest to the lookout, climbed the 32 steps of the staircase, and arrived at the catwalk in the way that Edgar had described. The figure had simply, by some mechanism I could not understand, arrived at the catwalk without any of the preceding sounds that should have accompanied its approach. The footsteps walked around the catwalk. They walked slowly. They walked the full perimeter of the cab. The footsteps stopped multiple times in front of each of the 4 windows. I could not see anything through the windows. The starlight was too dim, and the figure was, by Edgar's description, dressed in light-colored clothing, but the contrast was insufficient to make out a clear shape against the dark forest beyond the catwalk railing. I sat at the desk. I did not move. I held my breath when the footsteps stopped at the southwest window, which was the window closest to my position at the desk. The footsteps were on the other side of the glass. I was about 4 feet from the window. The figure, if it was looking through the window, was looking directly at the desk where I was sitting. I do not know whether the figure could see me in the dark. I do not know whether the figure knew I was there. The footsteps moved away from the southwest window. The footsteps walked to the cab door. The footsteps stopped at the door. The door handle turned down. I could see the handle in the dim starlight. The handle moved slowly, deliberately, the way Edgar had described. The handle turned to the bottom of its travel, and the deadbolt prevented the door from opening. The handle turned back up to the neutral position. There was a pause. The handle turned down again. Same result. The handle turned back up. The pattern repeated. I counted the attempts. The figure attempted to open the door 14 times, the same number of attempts that Edgar had documented in his entry from August 18th, 2024. After the 14th attempt, the handle did not turn again. There was a long pause. I could hear nothing. I did not hear footsteps walking away. I did not hear anything moving on the catwalk. The cab was silent. I waited for several minutes. The silence continued. I did not know whether the figure was still on the catwalk, standing silently outside the door, or whether the figure had left by some mechanism I could not detect, the way the figure had arrived without the sound of climbing the staircase. At 4:38 a.m., the silence was broken by a sound. The sound was a single soft knock on the cab door. The knock was the kind of knock that a person makes when they are trying to be polite and not aggressive, when they are trying to attract the attention of someone inside without alarming them. The knock did not repeat. There was a pause of about 30 seconds. Then a voice spoke through the door. The voice said, "John." The voice was a man's voice. The voice was calm and measured. The voice did not sound urgent or threatening. The voice sounded like a person who was used to being responded to. The voice said, "John, I know you are inside. I know you have read the logbook. I know what Mrs. Ruiz told you on the radio. I want to tell you something that the logbook does not contain. I would like you to listen. I am not going to try to enter. I have already established that the door will not open to me. I am going to speak. Please listen." I sat at the desk. I did not move. I did not respond. I held the flashlight in my hand without turning it on. I waited. The voice continued. The voice spoke for what I would later estimate was approximately 23 minutes, though I did not check my watch during the speaking because I did not want to move. The voice was measured throughout. The voice did not raise. The voice did not become emotional. The voice was the voice of a man giving a calm and detailed account of something he had been waiting a long time to explain. I am not going to give you everything the voice said. I am going to give you what I am willing to share, which is most of it, with some omissions that I will note as I make them. The omissions are details that I have decided are not mine to publish, either because they involve specific accusations against people who have descendants still living, or because they involve information that I have not been able to verify through any source other than the voice itself. I am giving you what I am giving you because I think the broad outline matters, and because I think the next person to hold the position at Cold Pine deserves to know what I learned. The voice introduced itself as Edward Halloran. The voice said it had been waiting to speak to a lookout for 88 years, and that it had been moving toward the lookout for the past 63 of those years, and that it had finally reached a position from which speech was possible, and that it was going to take advantage of the position to say what it needed to say. The voice acknowledged that it was speaking in a way that had no precedent in the documented record, and that I was the first lookout who would receive the explanation directly. The voice asked me to please not interrupt and to please not respond. The voice said that responses would not change anything and would not extend the conversation because the conversation had a fixed duration that was determined by factors outside the control of either of us. The voice told me that it had died at the lookout site in April of 1936 during the construction of the original structure. The voice told me that the death had been the result of an incident involving the foreman of the construction crew, a man whose name the voice gave, but which I am not going to repeat here, and two of the CCC enrollees, whose names the voice also gave, and which I am also not going to repeat here. The voice described the incident in detail, yet the incident had involved a dispute over wages, a physical altercation, and what the voice described as a deliberate decision by the foreman and the two enrollees to conceal the death rather than report it to the authorities. The voice described where the body had been buried. The location was the clearing at bearing 247. The voice said the body was still there. The voice said that the foreman had instructed the two enrollees to maintain the cover story that Edward had simply walked away from the construction site and disappeared. The voice said the cover story had been accepted by the authorities at the time, partly because the authorities had not investigated the disappearance with any rigor, and partly because the foreman had been a man with connections in the regional CCC administration, who had ensured that the investigation was not pursued aggressively. The voice gave names and positions of the people in the regional administration who had been involved in suppressing the investigation. I am not going to repeat those names either. The voice said that the body at the clearing had remained undiscovered for the past 88 years. The voice said that the lumber company that had purchased the surrounding land in 1947 had not in any of its operations disturbed the section of land where the body was buried. The voice said that the body was, at the location it had specified, approximately 3 feet below the surface, and beneath a particular configuration of stones that the foreman and the 2 enrollees had used to mark the burial site so that they could find it again if they needed to. The voice said that it had begun appearing at the Bearing 247 location in 1961 because Margaret Hollis had been the first lookout who had been observant enough and consistent enough that the voice had been able to use her observation as a means of communication. The voice said that the smoke and the light and the sound that Margaret had observed had been the voice's earliest attempts to attract the attention of someone who would, eventually, investigate the location. The voice said that Margaret had decided not to investigate, and that Frank had decided not to investigate, and that Walter had decided not to investigate, and that Edgar had decided not to investigate, and that the voice had, over the decades, developed the slow approach toward the lookout as a means of escalating the request for attention. The voice said that the climbing of the staircase in 2023 and 2024 had been a final escalation, and that the attempts to open the door had been a final attempt at direct contact. The voice said that the door had refused to open because the voice could not, by some constraint that the voice did not fully understand, enter a structure that was occupied by a person who was actively choosing to be inside it. The voice said that the constraint was, by the voice's understanding, related to consent, and that the constraint had operated throughout the 88 years to prevent the voice from approaching people who had not, in some way, opened themselves to the approach. And yet the voice said that Margaret had opened herself to the approach by choosing to observe and document the smoke. The voice said that Frank had opened himself by choosing to continue Margaret's observations. The voice said that Walter and Edgar had opened themselves by the same mechanism. The voice said that I had opened myself by reading the logbook and by speaking with Mrs. Ruiz, and that I had subsequently closed myself by locking the door and by deciding not to investigate the Bearing 247 location, and that the closing had created the condition under which the voice could speak through the door but could not enter. The voice said that it was going to ask me to do something. The voice said that I was free to refuse. The voice said that the asking was the purpose of the entire 88-year sequence, and that I was, by virtue of my position and by virtue of the choices I had made in the past week, the first lookout who had reached the point of being able to receive the asking directly. The voice asked me to report the body to the appropriate authorities. The voice said that the location was on private timberland, but that the discovery of human remains on the land would trigger an investigation by the local sheriff's office and by the state, and that the investigation would, by the voice's expectation, eventually result in the identification of the body as Edward Halloran and in the closure of the case as a homicide that had been concealed in 1936. The voice said that the foreman and the 2 enrollees were all dead and that no one would be prosecuted. The voice said that the purpose of the report was not prosecution, and that the purpose was identification and acknowledgement. The voice said that if I made the report, the voice would, by the voice's understanding of the constraints under which it operated, no longer have any reason to appear at the Bearing 247 location. The voice said that the appearances had been a means to an end, and that the end was the report, and that once the report had been made, the means would no longer be necessary. The voice said that it could not promise that the appearances would stop, because the voice did not fully understand the mechanism that produced the appearances, but that the voice's expectation was that they would stop. The voice said that if the appearances did stop, the lookout position at Cold Pine would, for the first time since 1958, be a position that did not require the management of the Bearing 247 sequence. No, the voice said that this would be, in the voice's view, a benefit to all future lookouts, and that the voice was offering this benefit as part of the request. The voice said that I should not feel obligated to make the report. The voice said that the voice understood that making the report would have professional consequences for me, because the report would require me to explain how I had become aware of the body, and that any honest explanation would involve the Bearing 247 sequence, which the voice understood I would be reluctant to disclose. The voice said that there were ways I could make the report that would minimize the professional consequences. The voice suggested that I could make the report anonymously, by sending an unsigned letter to the sheriff's office with a description of the location and a recommendation that they investigate. The voice said that an anonymous report would, by the voice's understanding of police procedure, be sufficient to trigger an investigation, and that the investigation would proceed without needing to identify the source of the report. The voice paused for a long time after making the request. I sat at the desk in the dark and I tried to absorb what I had been told. The voice was, by every audible characteristic, the voice of a calm and reasonable man explaining a problem and asking for help with it. The voice was, by every contextual characteristic, the voice of something that had been trying to communicate with the lookouts at Cold Pine for 63 years and had finally found a way to do it. I did not know what the voice was. I did not know whether the voice was, in any meaningful sense, Edward Halloran, or whether the voice was something that was using Edward Halloran's identity for reasons of its own. I did not know whether the body the voice had described actually existed at the location the voice had specified, or whether the voice was telling me a story for some purpose I could not identify. The voice said, "John, I am going to stop speaking now. I am going to leave the catwalk. I am not going to come back tonight. I would ask that you consider what I have said. I would ask that you make whatever decision you make based on whatever values you hold. I am not going to threaten you. I have no leverage to threaten you with. I am going to ask, and you are going to decide, and I am going to live with whatever you decide. And I would like to thank you for listening. I have been wanting to be heard for a long time." The voice stopped. There was a long pause. Then I heard the sound of footsteps on the catwalk, walking away from the door, walking around the cab. The footsteps did not, this time, walk toward the staircase. The footsteps simply faded, as if the figure was walking off the catwalk into the air, or as if the figure was, by some mechanism, ceasing to be present without going anywhere. I did not hear the staircase. I did not hear anything below the catwalk. The footsteps simply ended. I sat at the desk for the rest of the night. I did not move. I did not turn on the lights. I waited for sunrise. The sun came up at 5:51 a.m. The cab was illuminated gradually by the morning light. I could see the door. The deadbolt was still engaged, and the handle was in the neutral position. The door looked exactly as it had looked when I had locked it the previous evening. I stood up. I walked to the door. I unlocked the deadbolt. I opened the door. I stepped out onto the catwalk. The catwalk was empty. There was no sign of anyone or anything having been there. The wooden boards showed no marks. The railing was undisturbed. I walked the perimeter of the cab. I looked at each of the 4 windows. I looked down at the staircase and the clearing at the base of the lookout. The clearing was empty. The forest beyond the clearing was quiet in the early morning light. There was no indication that anything had occurred during the night. I went back inside the cab. I sat at the desk. I made coffee on the propane stove. I drank the coffee, while I made my morning weather observations. Now, I called the observations in to dispatch. The dispatcher was Patty. She greeted me cheerfully. She asked how my night had been. I told her it had been quiet. She told me to have a good day. I want to tell you what I decided and what I have done in the weeks since, and what has happened at the lookout since the night the voice spoke to me. I decided to make the anonymous report. I made the decision over the course of about 2 weeks. I considered the question carefully. I considered the possibility that the voice had been lying, or had been mistaken, or had been something other than what it claimed to be. I considered the possibility that the location the voice had described did not contain a body, and that an anonymous report would result in the sheriff's office expending resources on an investigation that would find nothing. Also, I considered the possibility that the voice had been telling the truth, and that the report would result in the discovery of the body and in the appropriate disposition of the case. I decided that, even if the voice had been lying about the body, the cost of an unproductive investigation was relatively small, and the cost of failing to report a real body was larger. I decided that the asymmetry of the cost justified the report. I decided that the question of whether the voice was Edward Halloran, or something else was, for the purposes of the decision, irrelevant. The decision was about the body, not about the voice. If the body existed, it should be reported. If the body did not exist, the report would not cause significant harm. I wrote the report on a piece of paper using a pen that I had bought specifically for this purpose at a hardware store on the access road during my next supply trip. I used the pen only for the report. I disposed of the pen after writing the report by burning it in the wood stove in the cab. The report was brief. It described the location of the body in terms that would allow the sheriff's office to find it. It did not include any information about how I had come to know the location. It did not identify Edward Halloran by name, although it noted that the body might be that of a man who had been reported missing in the area in April of 1936. It recommended that the sheriff's office investigate. I mailed the report from a post office in a small town about 2 hours from the lookout during another supply trip. That's without including a return address. I used a generic envelope and a stamp that I had purchased at the post office at the same time I mailed the letter. I did not have any other contact with the post office during that visit. The letter was, by every reasonable measure, untraceable to me. The sheriff's office investigated. I learned about the investigation from a small article in a regional newspaper that I happened to see during a subsequent supply trip. The article reported that the sheriff's office had received an anonymous tip about a possible burial site on private timberland in the Stanislaus National Forest area, and that an investigation had been conducted, and that human remains had been recovered. The article reported that the remains were being analyzed by the State Forensic Laboratory and that an identification was pending. And yet the article did not include any further details. I read the article in the truck on the way back to the lookout. I sat in the truck in the parking area at the bottom of the access road, and I read the article twice. I felt, in some way that I cannot fully articulate, that I had done what I had been asked to do, and that the request had been a real request and had been fulfilled. The Bearing 247 sequence did not occur on the next new moon. The smoke did not appear at 3:14 a.m. The light did not appear at 3:23 a.m. The figure did not appear at the clearing, or at the staircase, or at the catwalk. I sat at the desk in the cab on the night of the new moon, with the door locked, the way I had on the previous new moon, and I waited. Nothing happened. The night passed quietly. And as the Bearing 247 sequence has not occurred on any of the new moons that have followed, I have completed 3 more new moon cycles at the lookout since the night the voice spoke to me. None of them have included any of the elements of the standard sequence. The clearing at bearing 247 has been empty on every observation. There has been no smoke, no light, no sound, no figure. The lookout has been, by every measure I can apply, a normal lookout in a normal section of the Sierra Nevada. I have continued to lock the cab door at night. I do not know whether the locking is necessary. I do not have a way to test whether the bearing 247 sequence would resume if I stopped locking the door, and I am not willing to conduct that test. The locking has become part of my routine. The routine is, in any case, something I would now do at any structure where I lived alone in remote terrain, regardless of the bearing 247 history. The locking is not a hardship. I have not had any further contact from the voice. I have not seen any figures at the lookout or at the bearing 247 location or anywhere else in my surroundings. I have not, as far as I know, been visited by anything resembling the figure that visited Edgar in his hospital room. I do not know whether this means that the voice's expectation about the appearances stopping was correct, or whether the appearances will resume at some point in the future, or whether the appearances will eventually occur to me elsewhere, as they did to Edgar. I do not have any way to predict. I am writing this account during my 4th and final month at the lookout. The fire season ends in 3 weeks. Yet I will leave the lookout at the end of the season. I will go back to my brother's house in Fresno. I will figure out what to do next. The medical board has not yet cleared me for return to fire crew work, but my back has been improving over the past few months, and I am hopeful that I will be cleared for the next season. I have not decided whether to apply to return to Cold Pine for the next fire season. The lookout is, by my current experience, a quiet and pleasant place to spend a season. The view is good. The work is manageable. The bearing 247 sequence has not occurred for the past 3 new moons, and I have no reason to expect that it will resume. I would, in many ways, be happy to come back. I am also aware that my decision to come back, or not to come back, will affect what happens to the lookout position after me. If I do not come back, the regional office will need to find a new lookout. The new lookout will inherit the logbook. The new lookout will read the entries, including the entry I am going to add at the end of the season, which will document the events I have described in this recording. The new lookout will need to decide whether to follow the procedures Edgar documented, even though the bearing 247 sequence appears to have stopped, or whether to treat the procedures as historical and to operate the lookout normally. I have been thinking about what to put in the logbook entry I am going to write. I have been thinking about how much to include and how much to leave out. I have been thinking about whether to include the voice's request and my decision to honor it, or whether to leave that part of the story out and to simply document that the bearing 247 sequence stopped during my tenure for reasons I could not determine. I have not decided yet. The argument for full disclosure is that the next lookout deserves to know what happened, the way Margaret and Frank and Walter and Edgar all wanted the next lookout to know what they knew. The argument against full disclosure is that the voice asked me to make the report anonymously, which suggests that the voice valued the anonymity of the source, and that documenting my role in the report in the logbook would create a written record that, if the logbook were ever examined by anyone outside the lookout position, would expose me to questions I would prefer not to answer. I have decided, after considerable thought, to write a partial account in the logbook. The account will document that the bearing 247 sequence stopped during my tenure. The account will document that the cessation occurred after the night the figure spoke to me at the cab door, which I will describe in detail. The account will document the request the voice made and the fact that I made the requested report. The account will not document the specific details of the report, the location of the body, or the means by which I made the report anonymous. The account will note that I have decided not to include those details for reasons of personal privacy, and that the next lookout will not need those details in order to manage the position. The account will end with the same kind of closing note that Margaret and Frank and Walter and Edgar all wrote at various points in the logbook. The note will say that the bearing 247 sequence may or may not resume in the future, that the next lookout should be prepared for the possibility that it will, and that the next lookout should follow the procedures Edgar documented if any elements of the sequence reappear. The note will recommend that the next lookout lock the cab door every night without exception. The note will recommend that the next lookout treat the logbook as the institutional memory of the position, and that they read all of the marked entries before their first overnight shift. The note will, in short, be the same kind of note that has been written by every previous lookout, with the same general structure and the same general advice. I am going to add one additional element to the note. I am going to write that, in my judgment, the bearing 247 sequence was a request for something specific that has now been fulfilled, and that the cessation of the sequence is consistent with the fulfillment having addressed whatever the request was about. I am going to write that the next lookout should, if any new sequence begins at the lookout that resembles the bearing 247 sequence in its patterns, consider the possibility that the new sequence is also a request for something specific and should consider whether they want to attempt to identify what is being requested and to address it. I am going to write this last point because I have been thinking, in the months since the voice spoke to me, about what the bearing 247 sequence actually was, and about what the relationship was between the lookouts and the voice. The lookouts had documented the sequence for 63 years, and the lookouts had treated the sequence as a phenomenon to be managed, not as a communication to be answered. The voice had, by its own account, been trying to communicate the entire time. The lookouts had not been able to hear the communication because they had been treating it as something else. I do not blame any of the previous lookouts for this. The phenomenon was, by every measure available to Margaret and Frank and Walter and Edgar, a thing that should have been treated as something to be managed. The phenomenon presented as something dangerous and inexplicable. The phenomenon escalated over time in ways that suggested it was a threat. The lookouts responded to it the way they would have responded to any threat, which was by maintaining distance and by documenting and by passing the information along. I would have done the same thing if I had been in their positions. I did do the same thing for the first week of my tenure before the voice spoke to me directly. The voice spoke to me directly because, by the voice's account, I had reached a particular configuration of choices that allowed the speaking to occur. The configuration involved reading the logbook, speaking with Mrs. Ruiz, locking the door, and deciding not to investigate. None of the previous lookouts had, by the voice's account, reached that particular configuration. Margaret had not spoken with anyone about the situation. Frank had inherited from Margaret, but had not, as far as I know, made similar inquiries. Walter had done research, but had kept the research to himself. Edgar had done extensive research, but had not, until his final year, spoken with his wife about it. The configuration that allowed the voice to speak was, by my current understanding, the result of a particular set of small choices. and the configuration was the kind of thing that could only have occurred at a specific point in the 63-year sequence. The point was, by the voice's account, the point at which I was the lookout. I do not know what to make of this. I do not know whether the configuration was, in some way, planned by the voice or by whatever the voice was, or whether the configuration was the result of accumulated drift over the decades that happened to converge at my tenure. I do not know whether I was selected for the position because of qualities that would have produced the configuration, or whether I produced the configuration because of qualities that I happened to bring to the position, and I have considered all of these possibilities. I have not arrived at a clear answer. What I have arrived at is a different question. The different question is whether the voice was the only entity that has been trying to communicate with the lookouts at Cold Pine, or whether there might be others in other directions from the lookout, on other bearings, on other schedules, with other patterns. The bearing 247 sequence was the only one documented in the logbook. The logbook was, by its construction, a document for recording specific kinds of observations. The lookouts had, by every available indication, been observant only in the directions and at the times that were relevant to fire detection. The lookouts had not, except in the case of the bearing 247 sequence, been looking for anything else. I have, in the past few months, started looking for other patterns. I have not found any. I have scanned the other bearings during the times when the bearing 247 sequence used to occur. I have looked for smoke or light or sound at other locations on the new moons. I have not seen anything. The lookout has been, in every direction other than 247, the kind of quiet remote position that the Forest Service believes it to be. I do not know whether the absence of other patterns means that there are no other patterns, or whether it means that the other patterns are at locations or times I have not yet observed, or whether the other patterns are at locations or times that I would not be able to observe, even if I tried. The absence of other patterns could mean many things. I am noting the absence for the record. I am going to finish this recording now, and I'm going to add the entry to the logbook tomorrow. I am going to finish out my season at the lookout. I am going to leave at the end of the season and go back to my brother's house in Fresno. I have not yet decided whether to apply to come back to Cold Pine for the next fire season. I have until the end of the year to decide. I will probably decide based on whether the medical board clears me for fire crew work and whether I have any other options that I would prefer over the lookout. The lookout is, in many ways, the kind of job I would have wanted before all of this happened, and is still, in some ways, the kind of job I would want now, given everything that has happened. If you ever take a position as a fire watch officer at a remote lookout that has been continuously staffed for many decades, please ask the previous officer about the logbook before you accept the position. Please ask whether the logbook contains entries that the previous officer considers important to flag. Please ask whether the previous officer has been managing any patterns or phenomena at the lookout that they have not reported to the regional office. Please ask whether the position involves anything beyond what the formal job description includes. The previous officer may not give you complete answers. The previous officer may give you the kind of partial answer that Edgar gave me, which was honest within its limits, but which left important information for me to discover on my own. You will, even with partial answers, be in a better position than I was, because you will at least know to ask the questions. And if you take the position despite incomplete information, please read the logbook carefully before your first overnight shift. Please pay attention to any entries that have been marked or flagged in any way. Please consider that the markings may have been added by previous officers who wanted to draw the attention of future officers to specific entries. Please consider that the entries may describe phenomena that have not been reported to the regional office and that the regional office is not aware of. Please consider that the phenomena may be ongoing and that you may encounter them during your tenure, and that the previous officer's decisions about how to manage the phenomena may not be the right decisions for you. The lookout at Cold Pine is, by my current experience, a quiet place. The bearing 247 sequence has stopped. The voice has not returned. The figure has not been seen. The lookout is operating as a normal firewatch position. I do not know how long this will last. I do not know whether some other pattern will emerge during the next lookout's tenure, or the tenure after that, or 50 years from now. I do not know whether what I did in making the report has actually resolved anything in a permanent way. I have, at minimum, addressed the specific request that was made of me. The longer-term implications of the situation are beyond my ability to predict. I am going to stop recording now. The fire season ends in 3 weeks. I will be home for the winter.